Dialogue, we will discuss the future of our city with two of its newest leaders. Please join us.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Every 3 years, Austinites have the choice of electing members to the City Council. Which candidates will best be able to lead that city poised on the edge of economic recovery and dealing with its other issues? The electorate has recently spoken, and their choices are Jackie Goodman, a longtime advocate for social neighborhood and city planning, and Bridget Shea, known to most as the director of the SOS Coalition last year. We thank you both for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
And I would like to, before we get into some of the more public issues, have you share with us something of, what, from your personal standpoint, brought you into this responsibility in city government? Something about where you're coming from. Bridget, could you give us that?
I have worked as a reporter for many years, and I spent a lot of time covering elected bodies, and probably like a lot of people in the audience for the Austin City Council and for other elected officials, sitting there thinking, gee, I could do a better job than these people. But specifically in Austin, one of the things that really was kind of a turning point for me, because I struggled with this decision, it was not an easy one to make, was watching really the plight of the people around the tank farm. The gasoline and fuel storage tanks in East Austin. And I watched in particular at a council meeting as mothers and grandmothers and children and people who were very worried about their health and the health of their children came and pleaded with the city council to please do something. And the council, the majority of them at that time, was not particularly responsive, and I was outraged. I just thought, this is wrong. And this is a clear example where city government needs to be responding to the needs of the people.
Okay, so that was a
it was a turning point for me, yeah. It really
incident.
Was, yes.
Okay. Jackie, what about your past in this regard?
Well, I think like Bridget that it finally came to a point where city government was so unresponsive, I mean deliberately unresponsive, that it was no longer a situation that you could leave alone. The status quo was not satisfactory, and so having been an activist in city affairs since about 1979, I decided that banging your head against a brick wall was not something you should keep up forever. Finally, you do make a move to try to be a part of a responsive government.
And you had, before running for city council, worked, I remember you were on the city planning commission.
Yes,
How long was that? And
a little over 6 years. Urban planning, maximum urban planning attempts were made. And that's also part of why I thought city government was not being responsive. Much of the recommendations that came from the Planning Commission was ignored by a council, or three actually, 3 councils.
so both of you were led to be less on the sidelines and more in the middle of the activity because you felt that you could make a difference and that would put you in a better position to act upon the plans that you knew needed to be acted on, or dealt with the injustices that you saw being perpetrated. I also be interested to know, are either of you from Austin originally, or did you move here, or what was that background?
No, I'm from West Texas.
From El Paso, right, originally? I'm from North Dakota originally.
Oh,
And came to Texas to work with Jim Hightower, who was then the head of the Department of Agriculture here in the state, and also to work with communities around the state that were struggling to change state law so that their communities would be better protected from out-of-state companies that wanted to dump hazardous waste in their little towns.
Oh, I see. So the environmental issue was early on in your
I had actually,
career.
I was working as a reporter and covering a whole range of issues up until 1988 when I came to Texas to work on environmental issues. So I came to it in the last 5 years, really.
Okay. You know, one of the things that we do on Austin Faith Dialogue is to have our guests give us a bit of a perspective on where they are in relationship to the interfaith community in town. And that'll be the focal point of our show today. And I see that as having to do in part with where's the interface, the connections that are practical, that are helpful, creative, and we'd like to have you comment on that. And also, before the program is over, a little bit of visionary thinking. Where do we as a community want to be as we go into the next century? And I just think about how are we going to get through this fiscal year kind of thing. And but let's start a little bit closer to home in regard to, before the show we were talking, I think, Jackie, particularly about the Austin interfaith, and you were giving some other examples, as with AIDS issues and so on. Where do you think that the religious organizations, the churches, the synagogues, and so on, can be of most help to you as a member of the City Council?
Well, and speaking of how to get through this fiscal year, I think that budgetary discussions are very important when we try to see what the community as a whole needs to address. We've had kind of tough economic times for many years now, and we have tightened our belt so much that we can see all the places where we haven't addressed. Well, roads, potholes are one that comes to mind easily, because every morning you realize that the roads are terrible.
The infrastructure of the town.
Right, right. And there are a lot of social needs that we haven't been able to address as well. So for me, interfaith and that connection and the ministries of the different churches is very valuable, because now I think is the time when we all need to come together as a community and each see what we can contribute to try to resolve some of the problems that have gone on for far too long. If you just focus on downtown, for instance, it's not just money that will make downtown a viable and live place. We have things like 6th Street, but we no longer have very many people-friendly streets as far as shopping or dining, and we're trying to kind of change that. Things like the RUDAT study address the changes that we need to make, the connections and the revitalization. But there are social issues that need to be addressed as well. So not only do we have to try to use our cash wisely and well for a redevelopment or enhancement of the physical aesthetics that we have downtown, but we have social needs such as homeless and jobless issues that need to be addressed. And that's where the ministries have come in, and I think have been much more active in the last, say, 5 years. Many of the churches have tried to take up the slack that as governmental entities we've been unable to address. And I'd like to see that expanded even more. I think that's what we're all about.
You can see more activity in that regard in the last 5 years.
I think so. Very visible activity.
Okay. Okay, Bridget, what do you feel about the religious community's response, what it might be?
Well, I come from a number of varied experiences, some of them very closely connected to the life of the church, if you will. I spent a year as a research fellow at Yale Divinity School.
Oh, really?
And one of my...
I was a graduate of Yale Divinity School.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I was there in 1984 and 85. And one of the things that one of the specialties I worked on as a reporter was religion reporting, which was a wide open field, really. Nobody else was covering it.
Right.
And it really is, so I had to find issues where religious problems and religious concerns had an impact on society in a way that would be interesting for a larger audience, because I was working for a national public radio station at the time. And I actually lived in a parsonage. A very good friend of mine was a minister, and she had not yet married, and she had a 5-bedroom parsonage in downtown Philadelphia.
Oh,
and
really?
she invited friends to come live there who needed places to live, and it was like a mini United Nations. There was a Japanese woman and a German woman and an Indian man, and people came from all over the world to visit. So I've had varying degrees of relationships with ministries that were struggling to I think really enact that slogan, if you will. I think it was Pope Paul. I was thinking this last night, that if you want peace, work for justice. And I think that that's, for me, that's a real guiding principle, and one that I think that churches and the religious community should be following.
Right.
And that does mean then a tremendous amount of activity on economic issues, on justice issues, on poverty issues, and all that kind of thing, and really working in the community.
Well, you know, one of the things that that Peace with Justice pairing those does, I think, is to indicate that there's at least two levels that religious community is called to address. One is the more immediate social ministries. I think helping people directly, social services, what the Salvation Army does is a very clear example of that. And we have now what is called the Interfaith Hospitality Network among several churches that host homeless families for a week at a time.
Oh, great.
And Austin is the first, by the way, city in Texas to do that. And we started that back in the fall.
That's excellent.
But then there's the advocacy side. In other words, it's not just enough to fish out the bodies as they come downstream, but to go upstream and see who's throwing these folks in.
Try and change the structures that are causing the injustice.
Yeah, which is more controversial. And you have to recognize that people are not always going to agree on how you go about that. But if you don't address, as in scriptural terms, how the prophets did in this regard, you miss a key to the causes. And I beg your pardon, I almost lapsed into a sermon at that point. That's an occupational hazard to me. But Jackie, as far as, getting at causes, I know that must be one of the things that led you into your career, and do you see the churches and the religious community as having a cause-oriented side to their work?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, the first time I became really aware of interfaith was during the affordable housing bond issue some years back, and I don't remember what year that was, but people who were involved in interfaith got very involved. They were out in the community explaining what those bonds were about, how they would benefit the entire city, and they were just really working hard. And then, of course, there were airport issues. Now, for us to worry about in the fiscal department, the budgetary discussions are things like the WIC program, trying to find more ways to hire youngsters who need work, and health care, clinic hours. Interfaith is involved in all of that. They are advocates, and I think it's a wonderful thing.
I think one of the things that Austin Metropolitan Ministries, which is is the sponsor for our show, has done is to, like Hands-On Housing is an annual event in which a number of homes are restored by volunteers from the churches and synagogues. And that's social ministry, and yet it makes people aware of, how is it that our housing stock has fallen into such a poor state. And I'd like to maybe save a little bit of the environmental aspect to the second end of our show, but I think we can anticipate even now how so many of these issues are not black and white, but shades of gray. And that when you have even religious bodies that are not always in agreement as to what needs to be done. I know the Bennett Properties issue right now, you have different churches on different sides of that. Can you all of a sudden, Bridget, in 1 minute tell us how to resolve those irreconcilable differences?
Well, I'm reminded when you said that these issues aren't black and white. Cesar Chavez used to say that the minority communities cared passionately about environmental problems. It's just that for them they were life and death issues. For instance, their concern about migrant farm workers being sprayed with pesticides, they didn't see as an environmental issue. They saw it as a very basic justice and survival and human health issue.
Okay. Well, I
So
see
they're not
one
black and
issue
white.
that we have to do right now, and that is to take a break. But we're going to come right back to that in just a moment. If you folks would stay with us, we'll see you soon.
Serving Austin means serving you. Each day, Austin Metropolitan Ministries is religion in action, providing affordable housing, caring for the elderly, marching against hunger, and much more. AMM promotes understanding, cooperation, and social involvement. So when we ask for your help, we're really asking to help you, Austin. To find out how you can help Austin Metropolitan Ministries help Austin through its member organizations, just call 472-7627.
Hello again. I'm Rich Thompson from Central Presbyterian Church, welcoming you back to this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue, in which we're having the opportunity to interview two of the new members of the City Council, Bridget Shea and Jackie Goodman. Just before the break, we were about to touch on what I think is perhaps a very, if not the most important, but close to it at least, and very symbolic of where Austin is today, with the division between the developers and the environmentalists. And Bridget, I mean, you were in the middle of all of that. Now that you're on the City Council, where do you think we're going to come out on this? Where would you like for us to come out? And this is part of the vision thing. Mm-hmm. Where should this city, how should we model that balance, which we know we have to have some between the developmental folks and the environmental people?
Right. Let me just step back for a moment, too, though, and comment on what I think was as much a part of the whole SOS movement, if you will.
And SOS means?
The Save Our Springs Coalition.
All right.
And it was the citizens' initiative to pass a law to protect Barton Springs and protect water quality. And I think it was as much a statement of frustration and outrage by the citizens of this community that their elected officials were not listening to them and were not responding to their clearly stated will.
Okay.
So I think it was as much an environmental initiative as it was a fundamentally democratic initiative.
All right.
Where the citizens finally had a voice with which to say, if you, our elected officials, will not guide our future as we clearly want you to, then we will have to do it ourselves.
Okay. Now that's the perspective on the past. Let's look
Right.
at the future.
The future. I think that every city, probably in the world, is going to be struggling with very, very difficult questions of how to balance growth with basic survival questions like how to keep our water clean. We saw that with the terrible flooding. Clean, readily available supplies of drinking water are not something that we can assume will always be there no matter what. And that's a very fundamental concern for the future of the entire world.
Okay.
Now, clean air,
but
very
the other,
basic questions
the other
like that.
priority that weighs in, though, and I've heard developers speak this with equal passion, unless you have a tax base. I mean, you don't have the means of preserving the clean water.
I think probably the most important perspective that I can cite on this is the economists, one of whom works for the Chamber of Commerce in Austin, another of whom is a fairly respected independent economist, who said in January of this year that the SOS initiative and other efforts by the City of Austin to preserve our clean environment will, in the long run, be a tremendous economic advantage for us because it's something that other cities are losing, so that in fact it will become something that draws people to our community. And I'm already hearing that. I mean, I've been hearing it for months and longer from people who are moving here from California.
That they see that we're ahead
They
in this
can't breathe
regard.
the air in some cities in California. It's too dangerous to go outside some days.
Yeah, okay.
The water, the drinking water has been polluted by chemicals seeping into the groundwater. And Austin has somehow managed to maintain that balance of a certain amount of prosperity and yet still keeping our water clean and our air clean.
Well, I think, you know, the assumption probably is that over the long run, good business is a good environment.
Absolutely.
And vice versa. In the short run, it's painful, though. I mean, if you're restricting some people from doing business in ways that they're wanting to do tomorrow, then I think that, how do you reconcile those, what are seemingly irreconcilables, Jackie, in your own mind in policymaking?
Well, I think there, excuse me, are a few basic facts that we need to keep in mind. Back in about 1982, I was doing research on various aquifers in the world, some who were, sorry, which were similar to ours in England especially. And even back then, the scientists were saying, ultimately what we may have to decide is that there can be no use over your aquifers because water is a finite source, a resource and a source, and only the state of it changes. The amount is what we have. And then secondly, when you are planning for your city and for your tax base, you cannot expand to the moon. There are certain limits that just happen naturally. There are geographical barriers. And what we need to decide is where our line is. That's what SOS was all about. And then as we develop and redevelop and expand our tax base, it has to be in a way that is going to secure our future as a community. How many people are in Austin who do not come from Austin, who've come from other places? They didn't come here to look at the buildings especially. They came here for what we are. We're a city of water, we're a city of environment, of government, of learning, of music. And we have to remember the assets that made us grow in the first place are the ones we need to keep.
Okay. You did a little bit of preaching right there, Jackie.
Sorry.
But I mean, you know, you talk about the quality of life, and I think that as both of you talk about the environmental issue, I can't help but remember, you know, in Genesis about we're stewards of the earth.
Absolutely.
And that you don't have to look at it from a religious perspective, but when you do, that's essential for all of our faith commitments. And but I think the other thing too, that beyond the environment is the daily needs, the struggles of people, and the city as a whole oftentimes is focused on East Austin. And that I-35, I remember one of our former city council members that was on the show referred to that as like a Berlin Wall, as far as segregating groups in town.
It was designed with that in mind. I mean, that was part of the city's planning process back in the, I think it was in the 30s. When they moved Guadalupe Church from downtown to the east side, it was partly to facilitate that segregation. It was an intentional policy by the city.
Historically, you see that as
Oh, yes.
as being a fact.
I think it's printed in city planning documents from that era.
Do you see that we are making any real progress in regard to East Austin that you can say is a hope for the future?
I feel like we are, although I'm also very conscious that there are people in powerful positions who see it as a threat, that particularly the environmental community and the East Austin community might be building bridges and trying to work together, and have been particularly destructive in using racial issues to try and divide our community even further than it may already be divided. I see a tremendous potential for real progress and real gains in that area, particularly as people in those communities understand more and more that environmental issues aren't a matter of someone's esoteric desire to save a spider or a bird, but that they have everything to do with life and death issues and people's health. I think the tank farm was a very a powerful understanding for many people in East Austin that environmental problems are life and death issues, they're health issues.
That was clear. I think less clear is the fact that I recall that as SOS issues have been discussed, you didn't find uniform support in East Austin for that. That there was a perception that if SOS were to be implemented, it would lose jobs for people in the minority communities, and that seemed to be a built-in conflict of interest. I see you nodding your head here. I think maybe, Jackie, you want to speak to that.
Well, I think there possibly was a perception that the empowerment that the Western environmentalists had was somehow at odds with protection and concern for East Austin. And I think that's a misperception, but it's certainly something that we all need to work on now, because if the perception exists, that's very close to just being reality. I-35 needs to become a road, not a wall. And I think that the time is right and people are ready to actually come together and celebrate the richness that we have, address the inequities and injustices of the past. And that's one of the reasons why I would like to have East First and West First renamed Cesar Chavez Boulevard. I think with MLK at the more central northern end of town, or center of town, and Cesar Chavez just north of the river,
Oh.
we can effectively make a symbolic gesture that says, we are all part of this community, and let's go from here.
Well, now, is there a move to rename it?
For me, there is.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'm sure other people are trying to do the same thing, but it is on the council agenda to set a hearing for it.
I see. Did you know about that, Bridget?
I've heard about it from Jackie, and I'm tremendously supportive. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, it's new to me, and I think it's symbolic in regard to those that have shown a way to break through barriers. And if the real Berlin Wall could come down, why can't I-35, if not be demolished, at least cease to be the psychological barrier and the economic barrier? And I think as we look toward the 21st century, is it really a possibility that the city is more integrated in terms of its economics as well as racially and otherwise? Seems, I just want to make one other comment in that regard. Integration has been associated with the schools, but as a sign of the wholeness of that, you know, as you suffer, we suffer. As you prosper, we prosper.
Right.
How that can be translated into Austin, Texas, the capital of the state. I mean, it seems to me we must, you're talking about people feeling that we've got some things going for us. And one thing we don't have going for us, however, today is time. So if we try to get into more of that, we'll run out of it. Just in the minute that we have left, if there's any one thing you'd like to have happen, would you please promise to come back to our show?
Oh, absolutely.
I'd love
Okay,
to.
that's what I would like to have happen. And
Definitely.
I'd like to thank Bridget Shea and Jackie Goodman for being with us.
And
I'm Richard
627.
Thompson on behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. Join us again next week for Austin Faith Dialogue. And peace be with you.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.